we're all here. I'd like to welcome Mr. Steve Seller, Municipal Advisor, Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Council Roles and Responsibilities Overview, and this meeting was requested by Mayor Johnson, who's not here to hear it. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Reeve Miller and members of council. Thank you for giving me a few minutes on your agenda tonight. I know that time is tight, and I'll try and be as quick as I can, but just again, thank you for having me on. I beat the freezing rain, and I hope to beat the freezing rain out of here as well. For those, I know I've met a few members of council before, but for those who don't know me, my name is Steve Seller. I'm a municipal advisor with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing out of the Kingston office. I have two areas of responsibility. We're all assigned geographically, and one is, of course, Renfrew County, including the city, and my other area is Peterborough County, including the city of Peterborough. So I've got sort of 29 municipalities spread well apart across eastern Ontario. One of the things we do is education, training, those types of things with councils. And I was asked to come tonight to do a little presentation on the matters that were just introduced. So I will go through those quickly. This is part of a larger presentation that we have, and I've only brought certain parts of it with me this evening. If there's anything that council sees later or has interest in later, I'm certainly more than happy to come back. And I would be more than happy to take questions throughout if that's all right with you. I find it easier sometimes to do them as we go as opposed to at the end. Always start with our disclaimer slide. This is the I'm not a lawyer slide. Legislation is there to guide you. The ministry provides legislation that helps guide what municipalities do. But we don't provide legal advice to municipalities, and the devil is always in the details. So certainly one of the things I cannot do is provide legal advice. I can't interpret the legislation for you. So municipalities are always encouraged, no matter what they're working on, that if there's questions around whether it is consistent with the legislation or not, to get independent legal advice. As I said, one of the things we cannot do is provide legal advice. Everything that I'm going to talk about tonight and everything that I'm not going to talk about tonight is all included in the Municipal Councillor's Guide that was updated just after the last round of municipal elections. So certainly if you haven't had a chance to go through this, I highly encourage members to do so. It's available on the ministry website, and it's an excellent guide on the roles and responsibilities of council and among other things that you'll run into in your term as councillors. This is all of what is in the larger presentation, as I mentioned, that we have, that we take out. So I'm only going to touch on really the first three bullets tonight, and I didn't bring every slide that was even within those three areas. But the big presentation, the 160-some slide presentation that we do have access to, covers all of these topics. So again, if there's something in there that at a later date you would like myself or maybe one of my colleagues, if it's around land use planning or affordable housing, I could bring colleagues back with me and we could do those at a later date. But for tonight, we'll stick mostly just to those top three bullets. So, getting right into the roles of council and councillors and staff. So it's important, obviously, that everybody understands their role in the organization, and we're going to just touch on the roles of these three areas tonight. Council as a whole, the head of council in particular, and the role of staff. So the role of council is set out, and I'm not going to read all these bullets. You have them available to you. They are cut and paste right out of the Municipal Act. Section 224 of the Municipal Act sets out what is the role of council. One thing I forgot to mention, and I'll stop and say it right now, I'm going to refer to probably mostly two, maybe three pieces of legislation through my presentation tonight. Two of the big ones, the Municipal Act and the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, are both under review right now. So the way I'm going to approach it is as it exists, because the review isn't complete, the legislation hasn't been updated, so it'll be as things stand tonight. But one of the things, obviously, that you'll want to watch for is any changes that come to those particular pieces of legislation in the future, and we'll be out, I'm sure, doing presentations on that when it does roll out. But just to digress a bit, so the role of council is set out under Section 224 of the Municipal Act in its current incarnation. As I said, I won't read all of those bullets because they're there. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit was when we talk about council, we talk about council as the collective, not the individual members of council, but rather council as a collective. And these are your mandated legislated roles under the Municipal Act as a group. And it's really important to understand that, when things come before you, council makes a decision. And when a decision is made, council has spoken. So when a matter comes before council, and there's bound to be some differences of opinion and disagreement on the matter that might be before you, and that's the time for healthy debate and maybe even downright argument if you can keep it professional and civil. But once a vote has been taken, council has spoken, and all of council has spoken. And it's very important that everybody get behind the decision, whether you are on the winning side or the losing side of that vote. You fight the good fight at the debate time, but once a decision has been made, council has spoken, and it's time for everybody to get behind that decision and move on. The head of council, the role of the head of council is also set out in the legislation. And you won't find the terms mayor, reeve, or warden in the legislation. The legislation talks specifically about the head of council. Renfrew County is unique in all of Ontario in that you have, I believe it's 5, including Whitewater now, municipalities that have both a mayor and a reeve on council. And the mayor is the head of council here at council, and the reeve represents the township at county council. No other county in Ontario uses that system anymore. So that's when I'm speaking outside of Renfrew County, I don't have to make that little caveat, but it's important for anybody in the gallery or who's watching to understand that both titles are here, but the mayor is the head of council. So the role of the head of council is also there on the screen. Again, that's cut and paste right out of the legislation. A couple of very important things. Heads of council in Ontario have one vote just like every other member of council. There's no particular power given to heads of council by virtue of the office, other than, they chair the meetings and there's some power there when it comes to being the chair at the meeting. They represent the municipality at the official functions. They're expected to provide leadership to council, but at the end of the day, they have one vote just like everybody else and in fact can be outvoted. The other one that causes some discussion and to be blunt, some problems in some places is that first bullet that defines the head of council. The role is to act as chief executive officer of the municipality. Some people confuse the Municipal Act definition of chief executive officer with that of a corporate CEO who is the boss. And that's not the case. Council is the boss, all of council, but the head of council doesn't, again, have any particular more power than anyone else. The Act does define what it means by chief executive officer in the context of municipalities and municipal councils, and it's much more about being the champion of council, the leader on council, being that leader, really. I mean, that's what it comes down to. It doesn't provide any kind of extra vote or anything like that to direct council. So that's important to note. Councillors really in Ontario, and including the head of council, their role is really broken down into 3 things: the representative role, the policy-making role, and the stewardship role. And these complement each other, but they can also some days conflict with each other, because there are things that you will do for the good of the municipality that might not be particularly popular in either all of the municipality or parts of the municipality, and there will be conflict. And part of your life now, and for those of you who are new on council, you've probably already figured this out, is to juggle those 3 roles as best you can. So the representative role, you are politicians, you were voted in by the public within within the borders of the township. And you are here to represent their views, but they will have conflicting views. Matters that will become before council, some members of the public will support, other members of the public won't support. Certainly, I know Whitewater is one, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that's done away with the ward system. Municipalities that still have a ward system, they have an extra little wrinkle in that their members of council are elected by a specific geographic area within that municipality, but they are there to represent the entire municipality. So sometimes those two things can certainly rub up against each other. But you can't please all of the people all the time. I'm sure you've realized that, and it's up to you to try and figure out the best method to fulfill that representative role. The second role is your policy-making role. You are a level of government, and the province, considers you a responsible level of government that's accountable to your ratepayers. Part of your job is to set policy at the local level and determine what direction you want your municipality to move in. So on the screen there are just some bullets on how policy is made. Won't go into those too deeply, but you need to consider the matters that come before you as a council and what's best for your municipality, and set policy locally as you see fit. The Municipal Act gives you a fair amount of leeway in what you're going to do locally, how you're going to govern as best you can for your residents. And then finally, there's the stewardship role, and this is basically your oversight role. This is you making sure that your objectives are being met, that the things you expect to see done are being done, that you've put the guidelines and the directions to staff in place so that they can carry out your direction. Where stewardship sometimes becomes a problem is when we get into questions of councils micromanaging staff. It's important to keep that. You do have a responsibility to make sure that your wishes are being fulfilled, that your direction you've given your staff is being done. What that doesn't mean is standing over staff's shoulder while they do the job. And you hear stories from around many places across the province. I'm not speaking specifically of here by any stretch, where members of council follow guys on the public works crew around while they're filling potholes or cutting trees or what have you. And that puts staff in a really difficult situation. And when council starts directing individual staff members, that puts staff in a very difficult situation. So certainly the stewardship role is there, and it clearly is your role to make sure that your direction is being fulfilled, but it's also from a little bit of a distance. Just a second slide on the stewardship role. So part of your job is to make sure that the policies are in place and the local policies and procedures are in place so that your direction can be fulfilled. Make sure there's a good flow of information between council and staff, and just establish policies and guidelines that overall, but then leave the day-to-day details of the municipality for staff to manage. Accessibility and transparency, a very, very important topic. What the Act now requires, there are certain policies that all municipalities must have in place. The Act, the province no longer tells you what you put in your policies. In previous incarnations of the Municipal Act, it was more prescriptive, and you had to have certain things within your policies. Now, you have to have a policy. You're expected to follow it. But we don't necessarily tell you what to put in it. So the Act does require you to have policies on how you're going to sell or otherwise dispose of land that you own, how you're going to hire employees, how you're going to procure goods and services, et cetera, et cetera. Delegation of powers and duties, there are limits on what council is able to delegate, but certainly one of the ways to keep things as efficient as possible is to delegate some things, some more day-to-day things to either a subcommittee or to staff, so that things can be done a little more efficiently, so that you aren't faced with long agendas and making decisions on absolutely everything. Whenever you do delegate, of course, you put in some reporting requirements or some sort of protocol and how staff report back to you on how they're using that delegated authority. So you're still on top of it, but you're able to delegate some of the stuff that things run a little bit more efficiently. Continuing on with accountability and transparency, the Act also allows municipalities to establish certain other offices or appoint certain other people in an oversight capacity. These are currently all optional for municipalities. Outside, the City of Toronto has its own legislation. There's some things it has to have. But the Municipal Act provides municipalities with the option of passing a code of conduct for council. And I always start with that bottom one. I sometimes think it should be first, actually, because it goes right next into the Integrity Commissioner. And for municipalities that do have a code of conduct for their council, many then appoint an Integrity Commissioner who becomes a third-party, impartial person who would investigate any alleged breaches of that code of conduct. You have the authority to appoint your own municipal ombudsman, and that is something that has not changed with the recent expansion of the Ontario Ombudsman's oversight over municipalities. You still have that ability. You have the ability to appoint your own Auditor General or to do your own lobbyist registry. Just getting into the role of staff. Staff really, in my mind, have two major roles. Obviously, they have a lot of roles, but I kind of split them in two quite often. And one is to assist council in its decision-making, so doing research and providing reports and perhaps options or recommendations. Every council might want something different from their staff. Some just want the information. Some want staff to come back on a particular issue. Some might just want information. Some might want staff to come back with 3 options, maybe a recommended option, something like that. It works a little bit differently everywhere, but one of staff's big roles is to support you so that you can make effective and well-informed decisions. Then, once council has made a decision, it's staff's job to implement those decisions. So you set the high-level direction and you provide direction to staff, and then they go off and they implement that. Some staff positions are required under the legislation. So at the administrative level, you have to have a clerk. You have to have a treasurer. It's right in the legislation. You shall have both of those positions. Some positions also have statutory duties that council cannot interfere in. So the clerk is a great example when it comes to running municipal elections. Clerks run municipal elections. Council has some say in some of the high-level decisions on whether, for instance, you're going to use traditional balloting or you're going to go with electronic means, an alternate means of ballot. But clerks run the election, and council can't interfere in clerks' statutory duties. Same with chief building officials. If the chief building official, for whatever reason, makes a decision on a building permit, council can't overrule the chief building official on those types of things. So it's important to recognize those statutory duties. This slide just simply sort of charts out the 2 roles. And the common saying that we use to kind of sum this up is that staff row the boat and council steer it. Staff are the ones that make things move forward on the day-to-day basis. Council sets the high-level direction and basically steers the municipality in the direction it wants the municipality to go. Just one slide on succession planning. This is not something that is mandated, but it is certainly something if you attend any kind of municipal conference, or especially where staff are present, it's very obvious, like in many other sectors, that there is a generation moving through that might not be long for that career. And succession planning is very, very important for municipalities. It's a way that you can identify your key staff positions and maybe identify who might be going to retire in the next 5 years or so, and maybe identify some staff that you have currently that would be great to step up into those positions when they become available. You can look at what training those people might need and start working to get them up to speed to take over those positions, or at least, at the very least, you're aware that you might have an opening in position X, in 3 years' time, and it allows you to start planning for that. Right now, I often describe succession planning in many of the smaller municipalities as poaching. You poach from your neighbors, and your neighbors poach from you, and it kind of just goes around and around. Some positions, more than others, are becoming very, very difficult to fill. I know chief building officials are becoming hard to fill. Treasurers, the number of treasurers who have come from outside the municipal sector lately, even within the county here, and some people have had to go out, a couple times to try and fill a treasury position. Those positions are becoming very, very difficult to fill. So just, it's a good idea, again, not something legislated, just a leading practice, but very, very good for council to be aware of. Just to wrap up this one section, so a strategic plan, I believe the township has a strategic plan, or at least we did start working on one there a couple of years ago. One of the last times I was here, I believe. So that's always a very important thing. Again, much like succession planning, not legislated, but really good so that you can look forward and be proactive, because there's so much that you need to do that's reactive. It's always great to have that proactive look at things too. So the next section, councillors as lawmakers. The powers of the municipality that the Municipal Act gives to municipalities are exercised by council. And again, that goes back to my original slide and it talks to powers are exercised by council, and that's you as the collective. And those are generally done by bylaw unless otherwise authorized. And there's a slide further on about that. But for people who've been around a while, municipalities used to do more things by resolution, but according to the legislation, you exercise your authority by bylaw. And bylaws are passed at open meetings where, they occur at your council meetings, which are open, and where quorum is met. So you're 50% plus one generally for quorum. There are some provisions for quorum within the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. If a number of members of council did need to declare pecuniary interest, quorum can be adjusted away from the normal 50% plus one, but generally it's half plus one. Meetings are defined in the Act as any regular, special, or other meeting of a council, of a local board, or committee of either of them. Fairly broad definition of a meeting, quite honestly. And it's a good, and we'll get into meetings a bit more in the next couple of slides. Committee, for the purposes of the open meeting requirements, a committee is defined as any committee of which 50% of the members of the committee are also members of council. So whatever rules apply to council around open meetings and those types of things, the same rules will apply to a committee if the 50% of the members are also members of council. Procedural bylaw. This is another one. Every municipality has to have a procedural bylaw in place according to the legislation, but the legislation doesn't tell you what to put in it anymore. And a procedural bylaw will tell you how your meetings are conducted. Basically, they're the rules on how meetings are conducted and how notice is given, those types of things. Certainly, it's your bylaw. If it doesn't work for you, you are more than welcome to change it if council agrees to change it. Certainly, reviewing it probably once every term of council is not a bad idea. As people change, things might not work anymore, and you're welcome to change it. Minutes. This is a question we get sometimes. So what the Act requires that all minutes shall be kept, and they shall be kept without note or comment. That's about the only direction that the legislation gives you on the completeness, I'm not sure that's the right word, but how much is in your minutes. So if you look at minutes from across different municipalities, they will look quite different. Some provide, sort of a running commentary of the discussion. Some are very, very basic in all that they provide is, a motion was raised by member X, seconded by member Y, and the result of the vote. It'll have, the topic will be there, but that will be about it. So they are very different. It is the statutory duty of the clerk to keep those minutes. Minutes also must be kept at closed meetings. And again, as it says there, it's the duty of the clerk. That's one of their duties, is to record minutes. So open and closed meetings, obviously transparency is very important. And what the legislation says is basically all meetings of council and local boards shall be open to the public unless certain exemptions are met. Before you go into closed session, you are required to pass a resolution. This is one of those times when I was talking about exercising your authority by bylaw, unless otherwise authorized. Well, this is one of those times. It says right in the legislation that you pass a resolution saying that you're going to go into closed session and what the general nature of the topic that you're going to discuss is, just to give the public a little bit of a taste of what you're going to talk about without actually giving it away. And I recognize that that's a bit of a tightrope that you have to walk sometimes. If I could provide any bit of wisdom from closed meeting investigations that I've read, it's that quite often, even when the investigator comes back and says, no, council went in for a perfectly legitimate reason, they almost always say, but the resolution didn't contain any or not enough hint of what the topic was. A lot of municipalities will quote the section and the exemption, but not give a little bit more. Meeting investigators often will comment on that. So I'll just raise that for your benefit. So what the Act provides are a number of situations in which a meeting may be closed to the public. And the word may there is underlined for a reason, because they are optional. If you can discuss any of these matters in open session without going into closed and you feel that is fine, then you may do that. Because the default position is the meeting shall be open unless one of these things applies, and then you may go into closed session. So they're there on the screen. Not going to read those off to you as well. You've seen them, I'm sure, before. Education and training I always find a little bit difficult to justify, because one of the things is when you go into closed session, you can't advance the business of the municipality. So why you would need to go into closed session for education and training? I mean, it's there. You certainly, if you feel that you need to use that exemption, you can. But anything I do, there's no reason for closed session. There's nothing I say that would be required in closed session. With the recent changes under Bill 8, and that's the bill that expanded, the big thing it did was expand the oversight of the Ontario Ombudsman. The Municipal Act was also amended so that there are some new situations in which council shall go into closed session. And on the bottom of the screen there's the bottom bullet is about freedom of information requests requiring council to go into closed session. There's also now, in that same section in the Municipal Act, the requirement that municipalities shall go into closed session if considering an ongoing investigation by the Ontario Ombudsman, an ongoing investigation by the locally appointed ombudsman, if indeed there is one, and or an ongoing investigation by a meeting investigator. So those are times that the legislation talks about you will go into closed session. The other thing about closed session, what I call the Vegas rule. What happens there stays there. If a matter is sensitive enough and falls within one of these exemptions that council believes it should be discussed in closed session, then that discussion should remain confidential. And things do come out. That does happen, but council should be, if you're in, for example, and this is the example I use, if you're in closed session talking about a personal matter about an identifiable individual, whether it be a member of the public or a member of staff, and that information gets out following the meeting, something was said about somebody's health or financial or something like that, you could be putting the municipality at risk of some sort of legal action if that information comes out. So just always be mindful that if council agrees that yes, this is something that legitimately we will discuss in closed session, and I make a little bit of a joke out of it, but it is serious. What I call the Vegas rule: what happens there stays there. So as I've already mentioned, the procedures for going into closed session: before you hold a closed meeting, you must adopt a resolution stating the fact that you are going to go into closed session and the general nature of the matter to be discussed. Generally, votes don't take place in closed session unless it's a vote to give instruction to staff or for some type of procedural matter. But basically, you don't make big decisions in closed. You maybe receive information or something of that nature, have a discussion, but votes aren't taken in closed session generally. Minutes still must be kept, whether you're in closed session or not. There still needs to be a clerk present. Doesn't need to be the clerk, but there needs to be a clerk present to take minutes in closed session. One of the questions I get, and it harkens back to slide 2, the I'm not a lawyer slide, is when you adopt closed meeting minutes, whether you do it in open session or whether you do it in the following closed session. There's at least 2 prominent lawyers around Eastern Ontario who disagree on that, quite honestly. So I'm not sure what your procedure is, but that's a discussion that does come up from time to time, and the 2 lawyers that I'm thinking about are sort of the best known municipal lawyers around, and they disagree with each other. So meeting investigations. So under the Municipal Act, any person who suspects that perhaps council went into closed session to discuss something that did not meet one of those exemptions can request an investigation. So all municipalities have to have a meeting investigator. You may appoint your own meeting investigator. Many municipalities use the service offered through the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. Some appoint somebody that they know, a retired lawyer or a retired chief administrative officer, something of that nature. But if you don't appoint your own, you default to the Ontario Ombudsman as your meeting investigator. And this is another thing that has not changed given the new legislation around the Ombudsman's role. This remains the same. You still have that authority to appoint your own meeting investigator.
I'll just ask one question, Steve, while we're on this.
Yeah.
When it comes down to pecuniary interest, only the individual can file pecuniary interest. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's actually the next slide.
Oh, okay. So, okay. Carry on.
Yes. No, that's absolutely. Municipal conflict of interest. So there's only one slide here tonight. We do have a little bit of a wider presentation dealing solely with the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, but for tonight we just brought one slide. Again, this legislation is under review, so stay tuned. The rules may change. They may not. We'll see how that works out. Yes, under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, and this applies to members of council and local boards, not to staff. The onus is on the member, and the member alone, to educate themselves on whether or not they have a pecuniary interest in a matter that is coming before council. It's not staff's job, it's not other members of council's job, and it's not my job to tell you whether or not you have an interest. The onus is on you to make that determination, and if that requires you seeking your own legal advice, independent legal advice, independent from the municipal solicitor, then that is certainly a wise thing to do. If there's any doubt, And certainly if you were challenged on whether or not you had a pecuniary interest in the matter, and you had sought your own legal advice and you had a written opinion from a lawyer that says, no, based on what you've told me, you're good, then that's a good defense should you get challenged, right? But the onus is on the member, and it's your own independent legal, not the municipality's legal, because if the municipality got hauled into court over something, the municipal solicitor would be defending the municipality, not the member. So that's very important. Of all the legislation that we deal with, this is probably the easiest. It's the shortest. If you haven't read it from cover to cover, I think if you printed it out, you could probably print it on 6 pages. It's very easy to read. It's pretty easy to stay on the right side of. One thing to always keep in mind, and it's a vocabulary thing, but I always try to clarify it. The legislation requires the member to declare pecuniary interest, so that's a financial interest. Only a judge will determine whether a member had a conflict of interest. So this legislation is enforced through the courts. If somebody wishes to challenge a member of council on whether or not they had an interest in the matter before council, they have to take it to the courts, and the courts will make that ruling. So what the legislation requires, and at the opening of your meeting tonight, you had a spot on the agenda for declaration of pecuniary interest. So it requires that the member disclose the interest and the general nature of what that is, and it has to be recorded in the minutes. They aren't to take part in the discussion or any voting on the matter. They aren't try to influence the vote before, during, or after the meeting. And if the meeting is closed, they do have to leave. If the meeting is open, there's no requirement for the member to actually leave chambers. Our recommendation, and it's simply that, it's a recommendation, is for their own protection, leave the room. Because if you leave your seat at the council at the Horseshoe and go sit in the front row of the gallery and cross your arms or sigh or huff or make gestures, somebody could take that to mean you're trying to influence the vote. Whereas if you remove yourself from the room completely, it's a bit of protection for yourself from that point of view. So not a requirement again currently, but let's just call it a good practice, if we would.
If a member of the public approaches us, something similar to what happened here tonight, what is our best response to them as to their options? Like, what would you suggest we tell them to do?
If they really want to go, they need to seek legal advice of their own. And they would need to explain to a lawyer, here's the facts as I understand them, and do you think I have, cause to take this to a judge? And the lawyer would direct them. Again, it's, for somebody to come and say, and I've seen this many times, but for somebody to come and say to either other members of council or staff that it's, they should inform the member, the onus is on the member. The onus is always on the member. But again, as I said, the legislation is enforced through the courts. So if a member of the public has concern that a member of council has contravened the act, it's through the courts is their remedy. Okay. And they would probably want to at least run, their understanding of the situation by a lawyer first, just to see, and maybe save themselves some money down the road or something in case, because there are exemptions. It's legislation. There are gray areas. There are exemptions. There are things that even if a member has an interest, if one of the exemptions is in interest in common with electors generally. So if it's something that it affects many, many, many people, maybe the whole municipality, maybe you don't have to declare an interest. One of the things, it's pecuniary interest, it's a financial interest. One of your jobs is to set taxes. Well, that impacts you as property owners, and it affects everybody else. So you have an interest there with electors generally in a situation like that. But certainly, my advice to members of council always is educate yourself on this piece of legislation. Again, it's short, it's easy to understand, and for your own protection, if there's any question, get your own independent legal advice and move. Consider that. Use that as part of your decision making.
Okay, thank you.
Codes of conduct, I think I mentioned this already. Municipalities have the option to establish codes of conduct for members of council. Again, it's something that is optional, and it's something you can look at, but it helps. It helps sometimes when there is behavioral, at a council meeting, things like that. So, Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. It's a mouthful, MFIPA, because we deal in acronyms at the provincial level, so we'll just stick with MFIPA. What I normally do at this point is just raise MFIPA's existence with members. It's not something, it doesn't fall under my ministry's mandate, it falls under a different ministry, and I don't claim to be an expert in it. I have colleagues, though, contact information for colleagues with the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services who work in this freedom of information, protection of privacy realm all the time, and I'm more than happy to pass on their contact info if you ever find yourself in need of it. I would highlight that there's both sides to this legislation. There is freedom of information, the public's right to access information that's in the care and control of the municipality, but there's also protection of privacy. So you will undoubtedly come across information in your jobs, either about staff or maybe about members of the public, that you need to maintain. You need to keep that private. You can't. So you have to balance the two sides. One thing that has come out recently is around access to council members' email. And the Information and Privacy Commissioner made a ruling not too long ago that even emails that you send through Hotmail, Gmail, whatever it happens to be, may be subject to freedom of information. So just be aware of that. My understanding, and again, I'm not an expert on this legislation, but my understanding was previously if you set up email accounts through the municipal server, those were absolutely subject to freedom of information, but if you used your Gmail account at home or whatever, it might not be. Apparently not anymore. So just be aware of that if you're using, I don't know if you have a Whitewater email address or just if you're all using Gmail, but be aware that your emails could be subject. This is the Information and Privacy Commissioner is obviously the final sort of decision maker on these things. So if a member, if somebody puts in an information request and you refuse it, it can be appealed to the IPC. So, and they make the final. And one of the reasons I generally defer those questions to my colleagues at Government and Consumer Services is they're up on the legislation all the time and up on the decisions of the IPC, and that will impact future advice. So I already talked about this a little bit, bylaws versus resolutions. So as I mentioned earlier, the Municipal Act states that you exercise your authority by bylaw. And so anything that you need to enforce, you do it by bylaw at a properly constituted meeting, et cetera, et cetera. Resolutions, municipalities used to use them more often for decision making, but certainly now if you want to express an opinion, a resolution is more what you would use in that case. So we get resolutions all the time from municipalities suggesting changes to legislation or what have you, but it's an opinion. If you need to enforce it, do it by bylaw. This is, we have 5 municipal services offices across the province. So I'm from the Eastern MSO in Kingston, and our general number is there on the screen. Certainly staff know how to reach me. and I'm more than happy. I deal with staff mostly, but I deal with elected officials and the public as well from time to time, and I'm certainly happy at any time to take a call or what have you if you need some clarity on anything, but certainly across the county, I think staff generally know how to get me. I've been responsible for Renfrew County for about 9 years now, so I think most people know where to reach me. So, thank you for your time. If there's any last questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them, but I know you have a busy agenda ahead of you too.
Thank you, Steve. Any questions from council for Steve?
I'm not happy the way you said that it's hard to get treasurers and building inspectors. Building inspectors giving us a lot of trouble.
Is he giving you a lot of trouble? Okay.
Any further comments or questions for Steve? Okay, Steve, thank you for coming up.
Thank you very much. And like I said, anytime if there's something else on that list that you saw or that you think council would benefit from, I'm more than happy to come back.
Okay, thank you. Thanks again. Okay. So we're moving on. Do you want me to just one by one ask for input? Okay. Starting with this. No, first. Okay, we're going to move on to the departmental reports. First one being the treasurer. Anybody have any questions for our treasurer or comments on the report? None. Public Works? None. Building Department? Seeing none. Environmental Services? Times 3. Who does? Steve, you want to speak to this?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Well, first is my monthly report for March. Is there any questions on it? Okay, perfect. I was tasked to bring back a little bit more analysis on yellow bags, which I've done. I don't know if anybody's read my report, but my recommendation, well, basically what the consideration here is, if the town doesn't wish to lose the revenue source and also maintain the foundation of the yellow bag program, as I interpret it, then perhaps it should be left alone. If considering otherwise, then the township must dismiss this revenue source or replace it. So I've given you a bit of an analysis on how you could replace it, how I've always viewed it. It's open to interpretation. So at this time, my recommendation is, well, I'll just read it. Acknowledging all the comments, concerns that have been brought forth, the Environmental Services Department recommends to Council at this time to put this issue aside until further detailed discussion and consideration can take place. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, Councillor Rieger.
Yeah, so first off, Steve, thank you very much for the detail, because it's easy when you're trying to make your decision. I've kind of changed my way of thinking here since our last meeting. When I take a look at this, when I'm looking at the budget and how much is going, be burdened here to the taxpayer coming up here with the new budget, and I look at the consideration of putting out 2 bags, my concern is that we will end up with recycling going down and garbage going up. We have a really good recycling program at this time, and I think I could even be as guilty if I had the opportunity. So at this time, I'm going to reverse my decision that I had made at committee, and I will be in favor of leaving this program as is at this time. Thank you.
Councillor Jackson, please.
I was just trying to find the email that I received from a gentleman. I can't, yeah, it was quite a while ago. Now, the first email I replied to, and then the second email, which I wasn't too impressed with regards to some threats. But then the third email that I received certainly justified what the questions with regards to, legitimate questions with regards to tenants and all of that. I think when you first implement something, it becomes hard to do when a user pay was in place. And I think my biggest reason for also changing my mind is how would they collect from the tenants? Because right now, the owners of the properties would then be tasked with paying the garbage rate on the tax bill rather than the tenants using, and therefore it would be difficult for them to get it back from the tenant. So taking into consideration all the tenants that we have and owners of buildings that have tenants, that's certainly a very legitimate reason why I would also change my mind, but and because of that only. I think it could have worked well, but I can't. I've thought about it long and hard and tried to come up, how do you do that? Do you send them out separate billings, invoices? How could you collect it if it wasn't, on a tax bill? There's no way of collecting it unless it forms part of the tax bill if they refuse to pay an accounts receivable invoice. So it just becomes too difficult, and I think for that reason alone, that's why I've changed my mind as well. I think it's the best way to go right now is to stick with it, but I would also ask Steve perhaps to see if there's any other vendors out there that does sell other yellow bags, and maybe not for this particular purchase of bags, because I understand you have to order them quite quickly, but perhaps for the next purchase of bags, I don't know if you want to order less than you would normally order, and then see if there is a better quality of bag, or ask them if there is a better quality of bag, would be my only suggestion at this time. And thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you. Any further comments? Councillor Olmsted.
Just want to reiterate Councillor Rager's comment. Thanks very much for the terrific amount of detail since we first started discussing this. I think this is an example of the spirit of what we were actually voted in to do, is to look at issues like this. And you've heard a couple of comments of people already reversing their decisions, and it's just because we analyzed it. But I want to continue down that road of looking into things like this, and if there's an opportunity to change, or hopefully it's for the better. I still think we can do this better than we're currently doing it. If it's not yellow bags, maybe it's tags, or maybe there's other systems. Maybe we don't do it now. But I'd like to continue down this road that I think there is a yellow bag issue. I truly believe that maybe this isn't the best way. Maybe it's the best way right now, but maybe it's not going to be the best way in a year or two if we come up with another solution.
Thank you. Councillor McLaughlin, and then Steve.
Well, I have bugged our treasurer numerous times and got a lot of information, because it bothered me after that evening, and I found out that there's 600 seasonal residents. So how are we going to set that kind of a levy? The other thing I found out, there's 1,000, was it 1,000 senior citizens? Or was it more than that? I can't remember, but that bothered me too, because we've got to realize those people are on fixed incomes. And those people, when I was approached, and I've been approached many times on the streets over this, and a lot of them put one bag every 3 weeks out, and you're going to tag them with the price of 2 bags per week. Those people are on fixed incomes. They don't have a chance to generate more revenue. So we have to look into that. I think that the idea maybe had some merit to it. I can see that, but I think we need to discuss it a whole lot more before we're going to start to implement it. One way of solving some of the problems with the bags is, it's been suggested to me, just tie a yellow bag to whatever bag you want to put out there, as long as it's within the weight restriction that we have. Just take another bag and then tie a yellow bag to it. I did mention to the CAO about using stickers, but that seems to be a problem, as I was told, when the weather's cold. So there's other ideas, but I think right now, and I think we need to have a couple of years, a lot more discussion. There was good discussion done. I think some good ideas came out, but maybe we need to discuss it for a couple of years and see then if we want to implement something different. But as my dad has said to me many times, if it's not busted, don't fix it. So I'm still in favor of the yellow bags, as I've been right from the start.